It's great that we have things other than the pandemic to talk about these days. The past couple of years, we've obviously all been overwhelmed by that. But I find it interesting that now that we get back to whatever normal is, and we go back to talking about some of the more traditional concepts of education and within the context of technology, social emotional learning being one of those, it seems that there's like a pre-pandemic and a post-pandemic take to it. For so many years, I would always hear, and I would go to sessions at ISTE or other places and talk about social emotional learning, and it was this theoretical, and honestly, I would nod my head sagely and say, oh yes, I know exactly what we're all talking about here. But it was always a little ethereal, right? It was always a little kind of like fuzzy. March 2020 comes around, it becomes really plainly obvious what that means. I mean, is to deal with kind of group traumas. But now in the past couple of months, it's taking on, it seems in the media, another sort of phrase. So maybe we could start off, talk a little bit about the organization and what your definition of it is, as I think we should go by that, and then we'll take the conversation from there.
Sure. So CASEL, which is the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning, was formed about 3 decades ago now. Basically, wow. there were researchers, educators, parents in the field who were saying in lots of different terms, right? Like there's something missing in education. Yes, we want kids to read and write and do math. Like all of that is critically important, but there's something else that needs to occur in schools in order to do that well. So we 30 years ago brought all these folks into a room, had a lot of conversations about what's the latest research telling us. What are we seeing in the psychology world, in the youth development world, in the neuroscience world, right? And brought all of that together to really define and find this field of social and emotional learning. So for the last 3 decades, CASEL has really been partnering across researchers, policy leaders, educators to really drive forward this field of social and emotional learning. And what is that? So what is all this social emotional learning? We at CASEL, and I'm paraphrasing here, you can look on our website for the official definition, but really basically, right, social and emotional learning is about developing all of these skills that last a lifetime. Things like staying motivated or communicating really effectively, understanding other people, and making decisions that are good for ourselves and our community around us. So it is a sort of developmental process that happens from the time we are born and now throughout our adulthood. And what the field of social and emotional learning then has said, if this developmental process is so important, what are some of the evidence-based practices that we can do in classrooms to really support this development of children? And what that has involved. So what does this look like in a school or a classroom? One, it could look different, right? There's lots of different approaches and ways to do it, but it often involves a couple things. Number one, it involves developing really positive, strong relationships for students between their teachers, with their peers. There's a lot of research that shows that when I feel supported, when I feel respected in a classroom, I tend to do better on my schoolwork, right? For good reason. It also involves being really intentional about how we teach academic subjects so that we're letting children connect to it both socially and emotionally. So that means that it might be like teamwork, right? I'm having an opportunity to not just learn from the teacher at a blackboard, but I have an opportunity to discuss that idea, to see how I personally connect with that idea, to have an emotional reaction to it. That's all part of social and emotional learning. And then thirdly, what most people will traditionally think about is perhaps a program in a classroom that has a scope and sequence that says, today we're going to learn about empathy, or today we're going to learn about teamwork. And I'm going to really explicitly put a name to those skills and teach that so that students are able to then take that skill and apply it across their lives.
So you see, I'm still nodding my head sagely as if I have myself wrapped around this. There are so many concepts. I mean, and there's so many different aspects to it. And, we can go down various rabbit holes, right? In terms of the politics, in terms of media, in terms of how this phrase, which you have so succinctly defined, but at the same time, I mean, even just using the word empathy, seems it can be a hot button issue these days. And I think especially when you look at public education, you know, educators and administrators are left in this very, very delicate balancing act. Can you talk a little bit about how you see this transformation of SEL, the politicization basically of the phrase, and what are the potential consequences for that implementation in school, and how do you at CASEL respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, as you're talking about this, I'm thinking about a couple things, right? Like I'm thinking about what I actually see as I go and visit classrooms and schools, and we've been on a listening tour with families across the country, and I'm thinking about what I hear and see from them versus what I might hear in the media or what I'm seeing from politicians, because I think those are a little bit separate things. They're overlapping certainly, but there is sort of on the ground level, when we're in classrooms, when we're in schools, when we're talking to families, right? Like there's definitely earnest concerns and conversations and questions around social and emotional learning that I think need to be surfaced, that we need to talk about. Most of the time, what that is, the concern is parents want more attention to social emotional learning. They want it done right. They want it done in a way that's effective for their children, right? Versus I think this like political narrative that we've seen in many aspects of education right now that is oftentimes a deliberate misinformation campaign. It's coming from politicians or extremist groups really trying to create a wedge issue here. And I think that part of it is separate than like the actual concerns of parents and educators, et cetera, on the ground. And so I think your question, like, what's the potential consequence of this, right? One is, I think what we heard clearly is that the politics are a distraction at a moment when we all are so focused on recovery for our kids right now. There's a long way to recovery. There are so many concerns we have right now around mental health, around attendance, around education. And I think most people, and the data bears this out, right? Like most people see social and emotional learning as critical to a piece of that recovery. But I think at the end of the day, you know, what I've often said to people is no one's actually going to remove social and emotional learning from schools, right? If you just listen to how I define this, every single school around the country, every educator, every classroom already has a perspective, a way that they are thinking about the social and emotional development of kids, because that's just inherent to learning. But what we are seeing happen is that these attempts to censor terms like social emotional learning or, you know, ban SEL over here, what it does is it just makes it that much more difficult to access the evidence-based resources that have been developed over, you know, 3 decades of this field and the effective strategies that educators have been working on. So it's not really a question of whether we're going to do social emotional learning right now. It's whether we're going to do it well. And that's what I fear the politics has an impact on. And, you know, in terms of what I think the third part of your question was, what's CASEL doing about all this? You know, and one thing we're doing is trying to elevate the voices of the real parents and students and educators on the ground, the 80+% who continue to say this work is essential and critical to the work ahead. We in the last year brought together 30 major education and parent organizations, including like the National PTA, including the Superintendents Association, the Principals Associations, all together in a coalition called the Leading with SEL Coalition. And what we've been doing is really spreading the accurate messages and information about social emotional learning, supporting parents who are trying to speak with their school boards and cut through the noise, supporting local school boards who want accurate information about SEL and not sort of the politic rigmarole around it. So that's part of what we're doing. I think, you know, if you look at the data right now, despite what you might see in the media, survey after survey after survey after survey show that the vast majority of parents, there's various surveys, but they usually range from 80 to 90% of parents say it is critically important to teach SEL, and even more so since the pandemic.
So it's not a question of awareness.
Yeah.
What you're saying, when you talk about 80, 90%, you're always going to have a 10% of everything, right? So if you're an administrator or you're an educator in a classroom who may be getting some pushback from people who haven't taken the survey or are part of that 10%, are there particular strategies that you can suggest for them? So we could go past the part of the conversation where we have to raise awareness among districts themselves. Is basically what you're saying, that educators get it and most parents get it?
There's levels of awareness, right? Like what we would see from the data is most parents, contrary to what some of the politics may have you believe, take the term social and emotional learning at face value. They support it. Now, they want to know, what does this actually look like in a classroom? And what does this actually mean for my kid, right? And that's what I would say is the biggest strategy, particularly for educators, is to open that bridge with families and parents, and to really begin the conversation away from all the education terms and the jargon, but say, look, what is it that you think is important for your student to be successful in my classroom? What are the skills they're going to need to have? What's the type of learning environment you want to see happen? And 9 times out of 10, right, when I've had this conversation with parents, you know what they say? They say, I want my kid to be able to work well with others. I want them to know their strengths and their weaknesses. I want them to be able to stay motivated and persist through challenges. And all of those things are social and emotional skills. And then they say, what type of classroom? Well, I want them to feel valued and respected. I want them to feel comfortable asking the teacher for help and raising their hand and speaking out, right? And all of that is social emotional learning. I'm also thinking about this educator who we spoke with recently, who shared that, he had some pushback from parents who were like, I've heard about this social emotional thing in the media. I don't want this social emotional thing. And you know what he did? He said, come to my classroom. Come see for yourself what it looks like. And he invited the parents into his classroom. And I believe a handful of them came into his classroom, watched what he was doing on a day-to-day basis, both like the explicit teaching of social emotional learning, as well as how he was naturally creating these relationships with kids. And all of them, he said, at the end of that visit, said to him, you know what? You're right. Like, this is something that I want for my kids. And, this looks drastically different than this like crazy news story I read or this thing that this politician shared. And that's what I think needs to happen right now, is really like having those conversations, because there's a lot more shared ground, I think, than we might think there is, given the media narrative.
That's interesting. I mean, that's something that I think, again, is kind of occurred as a result of the pandemic in terms of greater communication with parents overall, right? I mean, we all became teaching assistants those first few weeks. And I certainly, and spoke more with my kids' teachers over the past 18 months than I had in 18 years of having kids in classrooms. So that seems like a really strong first, and maybe not the only step, in terms of just increasing communication, making it clear what it is, have an open house, leave it open for questions, and then that kind of deflates the tension.
Yeah, I think so. And look, I'm a parent myself, right? I have 2 kids in public schools right now, down in Texas here. And I have lots of questions about what's going on in their classrooms. And I believe, as a parent, that parents have an absolute right to have their voices heard, to engage in the classrooms, to be a partner with the teacher, right, in what children should be learning. And I think most parents believe that, right, including the ones who are educators themselves. I think this is also, one thing that CASEL has really been focused on for 30 years has been the research and the evidence, right? This isn't just fluff. It's not just like something we think is nice to do in the classroom, but it's something that we are looking really deeply at in terms of what are the evidence-based effective practices that lead to specific student outcomes. And I'm talking about academic achievement. I'm talking about social and emotional skills development. I'm talking about their mental wellness. I'm talking about long-term outcomes like graduation. So I also think it's really important for educators and education leaders, right, to say, like, let's look at our practices. What are our continuous improvement processes that we have in place that make sure this is working with kids? And I will tell you, I think like sometimes the biggest gap is like, you may think you're doing it right, and then you talk to the students and say, hey, is this working for you? And you're going to get tons of feedback. We've written a lot about this, but I think one of the most important things that educators can also do is get input from their students, right? Like, what's working? What's not working? How do you feel in my classroom? Do you feel supported? How are the SEL lessons resonating? Things like that, I think, can really go a long way as well.
It's so funny that you just bring up student agency, right? I mean, then that's like, it's kind of like a no duh, but it's like, yeah, I mean, it's almost like we were with parents before the pandemic. I mean, covering this education technology for so many years, there's only a handful of times I even thought about bringing parents into the conversation or whatever these dynamics. And as you said, it's like, ask the students. I mean, again, my beta testers here at home are so much more self-aware of their own learning journey, right? And they have feelings, and especially over these past 3 years have learned to express those feelings much more effectively than I ever did growing up.
Yeah, I mean, I was a teacher way back when as well, too. And I remember thinking I was doing everything right. Why aren't these kids listening? Like, why aren't they listening? It must be something going on at home, before I stopped to like have those conversations and get that feedback. And I'm like, oh, wait, there are things like I could be doing better as well. Like, certainly there are other things going on, but there's definitely things like we can continue to improve as well.
Yeah. Well, look into your crystal ball here a little bit over the next, say, 3 or 4 years. I guess you're hoping that this is just kind of a blip, but talk about where you see SEL going in terms of both being a politicized phrase, but also just in terms of the concept itself.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the politics, I don't know where it's all going. I think this is social emotional learning is part of this much bigger, political education culture war sort of conversation. I hope people are slowly coming to their senses around it. I am seeing some movement there. In Montana recently, this past year, there was a state legislator who tried to introduce a bill banning social and emotional learning. And at the hearing, so many educators and parents came to the hearing and spoke up and said, like, no, this is what it actually looks like. This is what we're doing. That the Republican legislator, you could see this on video too, she turns around at the end of this hearing and she said, you guys have taught me so much. I didn't have a clear vision of what social emotional learning is, and I could hear clearly that it is effective and we need it right now. And she basically declined to move that bill forward, and it's all but dead right now in that state legislator. So I think there is opportunity for movement and growth and a better understanding of what kids need. And I'm hoping this conversation is coming back towards like a sensible conversation around like, what are we all doing to work together for children? In terms of the social emotional learning field, there's a couple of areas I think that are sort of burgeoning right now that I'm really excited to see. One is actually around this family engagement piece. There's a lot of work being done. We're sort of partnering with a number of different organizations and with schools around deeper partnerships between families and schools around social emotional learning, so that it's not just this class or this thing that happens in school, but it's really this continuum curriculum. And what we're saying really is that, one is we say parents are the first SEL teachers that a kid ever has, and probably the most important, hands down, right? And they bring tons of expertise about their children, their strengths, what works for them. And when we could create those partnerships, I think you could create a through line for every moment of the child's life around their social and emotional development. So that's an area I'm really excited about. We're also seeing a lot more interest right now in academic and SEL integration. So some of those examples I shared up top around what does it look like when social emotional learning is really woven throughout a math lesson or throughout a social studies lesson. And what it often looks like, right, is what research says is sort of the best teaching, which means like kids are engaged, they have agency, as you were saying, they have opportunities to share their perspectives, to grapple deeply with a topic. So that's another area I'm really excited about. And then the third area, I think, and we're having a whole conference about this in November, is around adult social and emotional learning. And what we are seeing, especially, there's so much talk right now around like educator stress, what's happening in the teaching workforce. And what we are seeing and what the research is suggesting is that educators' own social emotional learning and every adult's own social and emotional learning is deeply connected to how children themselves are going to develop socially and emotionally. And so, as a parent, anyone can tell you this, right? Like my kids model my good and bad sort of emotional management skills and social skills. So I think there's a lot of work beginning to be done in that field as well. That I think is where you'll see this field move in the next few years.
Because much like how all of us, both children and adults, were handed iPhones in 2007 without any sort of instructions on how to use it or how to use social media, I'll speak for my particular demographic. There wasn't much socially emotional learning going on when I was in school, at least to the effect that there is now. And I needed to relearn it myself. So that sounds like a really kind of promising avenue that will be helpful in terms of everyone having an understanding of this, right?
Yeah, I mean, speaking of cell phones, I was just having a conversation with some folks around AI and social and emotional learning, which, if anyone's been paying attention to the news, I think, this world of ChatGPT and AI is about to shake up all aspects of our society, including education. And I think there's a lot of social and emotional implications there, right? Like you can replace a lot of things, but you can't replace human connection. You can't replace that deep, like empathy. And there's always, and we're going to learn how to use this AI technology really responsibly. And all of that's going to take social emotional learning. So that's probably another thing I'll add to that list of where this is all going in the next few years is I think that technology shakeup is going to impact SEL like many other education fields.
Well, I hope we can table that one to our next conversation. Because that would take a whole other episode. But Justina, again, really appreciate your time and your insights. I think will be really valuable for our readers and listeners. And I hope we can catch up again.
Great. Thanks so much, Kevin.